I'm Professor Stephen Coleman, and I've spent many years researching and writing about political communication. I'm interested in how politicians speak to us, how we speak to them, and what we think of each other. In this episode, we're looking at exploring political body language.
Visual indicators are not monolithic. It's rare that someone is operating in a single modality, for instance, just outright anger and threat in every interaction, or utter cooperation and affiliation in every interaction. There's usually a combination between attempts at dominance and attempts at what we would call appeasement. Now, when you're ganged up on and there's a surprise attack, which is essentially what Zelensky walked into, and when you're entering a meeting in a room with cameras going and the script suddenly flips and you're now kind of attacked as the enemy or an ingrate and very harshly critiqued and belittled, it's really kind of unsettling. It'd be hard for anybody to really kind of respond well in that situation.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
I'm feeling rather like one of those ventriloquists who used to appear on BBC Radio in the 1930s. Look, my lips aren't moving. How the hell am I supposed to know whether they're moving? You're on the wireless. I'm talking today about politicians' body language. But I have no bodies to show you because this is an old-fashioned podcast, so you'll just have to imagine the pictures yourself. Sorry. So, what is body language, or non-verbal communication, as scholars refer to it? Well, all communication includes unconscious, non-verbal elements. People don't just communicate vocally and verbally, but they do so through the expressive features of their body. Posture and hexis, how they stand, facial expression, gaze, gesture, tone of voice, blushing, sweating, to name just some aspects. And voice itself is not a discrete organ like the ear or the eye, but it's an embodied process entailing the complex choreography between different organs of the body for its production. Stated simply, voice emerges from the interruption of regular breathing rhythms by sounds generated by airflow from the lungs, converted to acoustic energy by vibration of the vocal folds located within the larynx. The respiratory system serves as a source of power for phonation by setting air in motion through the vocal tract. The larynx acts as an oscillator to convert this aerodynamic power to acoustic energy. Finally, the sound is filtered through vibrations in the way the vocal folds are manipulated by the tongue, jaw, soft palate, and lips. It's a mistake to think of the mind and the body speaking two different languages, the former cognitive and the latter somehow metaphysical. In fact, both constitute a single expressive activity. While language permits abstract reasoning, self-reflection, recalling the past and planning for the future, non-verbal communication tends to reflect present feelings, the immediacy of central presence and reaction to the environment. Now, in studies of political communication, too much attention is often paid to the semantic interpretation of verbal language, leaving what is unsaid but still enacted as some sort of metaphysical mystery. However, it's often the inauthentic look, the angry move of the body, the embarrassed gesture that cut through the surface of well-rehearsed speech and reveal the true feelings, motives, or values of politicians. It's easier for political commentators to control what they say than to mask how they feel. This is because non-verbal behavior often involves leakage, that is to say, aspects of who we really are and how we're actually feeling that can be managed through carefully edited speech are much harder to repress non-verbally. The body gives off signals that disclose more than we might wish to disclose. For example, a politician who's bored talking to a group of people might do a good job in saying how fascinating she's finding the conversation, but she might give off bodily signals through her facial expression or stance that indicate she'd rather be somewhere else. Nonverbal behavior evokes forms of affective response that are often more instant and intense than words alone. A smiling politician, perhaps in the presence of babies or young children, tells a story of compassion that talking about child-friendly policies might not manage to convey. Conversely, aggressive postures of power or even bullying, as in that notorious encounter between Trump and Zelensky in the Oval Office, can convey deeply negative impressions, even to those who are not following the words spoken. As citizens and voters, we tend to trust nonverbal signals, regarding the semiotics of political communication as being somehow less open to manipulation than scripted speech. But how far should we base political evaluations upon nonverbal images? How reliable a guide to political veracity is nonverbal communication? And if it is reliable, how should we study it? Well, to answer those questions, I have the ideal guest. He's the Marshall and Charlene Formby Regents Professor of Strategic Communication in the College of Media and Communication at Texas Tech University. He's the co-author of a tremendous book called Image Bite Politics, News and the Visual Framing of Elections, and he's one of the world's leading experts on non-verbal communication. His name is Erik Bucy. A key puzzle to which this podcast keeps returning concerns what politics sounds like. We're interested in how you know a politician just by the sound of their voice. Some people might say, why do they sound so weird? But of course, not all communication involves sound. There's an important non-verbal element. And that's what I want to ask you about today. Are there non-verbal tics, tricks, and habits that mark out politicians? Are there features even prior to language that tell us that a person is acting like a politician?
Yes, I would say absolutely. And thank you for having me on your podcast. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. There's a school of thought in kind of the popular world of political analysis that visuals are essentially kind of optics that can be manipulated and that may send a meaning that really the press is just going to take in whole cloth and interpret the way the politician wants. The politician has control over their image if they set up an event, for instance, and that the public is just going to, internalize this for the intended meaning. That's actually not the case. And the way I think about visuals, and this is going to sound a little bit strange, but may make sense as I explain it, is in terms of dominance hierarchies. And I study the visual aspect more from a behavioral point of view in terms of the meaning of certain social signals that we're constantly projecting. And it does happen through the voice. Once you put everything in a footing of nonverbals, then you have the ability to integrate things like voice as well as behavior, smiles, facial expressions, and gestures. And how does voice figure nonverbally? Well, you think of tone, you think of the force of the voice, you think of the softness or the strength of the voice. We certainly saw that in the 2024 debate with Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And so voice also leads to a sense of dominance, or on the flip side of that, it's subordination. And so when you start to look at politics as a contest for dominance and attention, which relates to a lot to journalism, then these kind of filters and our frameworks of explanation suddenly start to make a lot more sense. It's not always the way journalists talk about it, though.
This is, as far as you're concerned, a primordial, perhaps even a biological element of behavior.
Yes, and I do subscribe to the view of this that comes out of what's called ethology, which is the study of animal and human behavior. So there's human ethology and animal ethology. And if you look at the patterns of leadership and power, they're very similar in some very basic respects between not only humans and primates, but humans and other animals, especially pack animals or social animals. And so there's a couple principles that are kind of foundational to what's going on in these dominance hierarchies. And one of them was identified by a researcher in the 1970s is that visual attention is given to the leader, in a social structure. And if you think about that, the connections to media and political coverage are obvious. So not only will a dominant individual get the most visual attention by others in a room or at a convention or at a leader conference, they'll also get more attention by media, and they'll dominate media coverage. And the cameras won't be able to look away, and they'll be on your television or on your video or in your social media feed constantly. And this is exactly what human ethology would predict in terms of how do you identify a leader? Well, just look at the person that everybody else is looking at all the time and commenting on and critiquing. And the second principle is we think about meetings and leader kind of exchanges and interactions and even debates. Really, the fundamental task there is to establish dominance. And they look like harmless meet and greets. They look like photo opportunities. They look like fluff and the stuff of, manipulated optics. But really what's going on there is an effort by both parties or multiple parties, if there's more than two people, to really establish a sense of I'm in charge here, even though you're the leader of another country or you're the leader of a party. I actually have more clout, more sway, more power over you in this setting. And when you take a person like Donald Trump, he's usually expert at this. He just has an intuitive feel for it. When you put him up against international leaders, you see a different Donald Trump.
What I find so suggestive about this is that there's an element of it being irresistible, that this is not something that the most manipulative of manipulators can do very much about, because things are going to, as it were, come through the veneer of control. And I find that interesting. I'm interested in how scholars of nonverbal political communication in particular go about making sense of specific images and scenes. So let me take an example. You just mentioned Trump, that will be known to most of our listeners, that White House press conference in February 2025, when Zelensky seemed to have been rather like a cornered animal facing Trump and Vance. And it looked as if there was a dynamic going on there that at one level was very obvious to recognize. But I suspect that at the level of scholarship that you're applying, there's quite a lot of detail that you can get from a single scene like that.
Right. And one of the things to keep in mind is that behavior and, kind of visual indicators are not monolithic. It's rare that someone is operating in a single modality, for instance, just outright anger and threat, just in every interaction, or utter cooperation and affiliation in every interaction. There's usually a combination between attempts at dominance and attempts at what we would call appeasement. Now, when you're ganged up on and there's a surprise attack, which is essentially what Zelensky walked into, and when you're entering a meeting in a room with cameras going and the script suddenly flips and you're now kind of attacked as the enemy or an ingrate and very harshly critiqued and belittled, it's really kind of unsettling. It'd be hard for anybody to really kind of respond well in that situation. And what you get is a move from, say, the initial invitation where there might be some affiliation. And what I mean by that is these are kind of inviting gestures, they're friendly waves, they're handshakes, they're smiles to indicate lack of aggression and almost a friendship type communication. In other words, an attempt at bonding. And then there's anger threat displays, which are completely the opposite and put you on the defensive and make you wonder what's going on. And so when Zelensky walks into that room, at first he thinks, well, there's going to be a friendly greeting, and this is kind of a press conference, so it's a little bit of a song and dance, and we'll smile and say some niceties and get to the real business behind closed doors. And that's obviously not what Trump and Vance had in mind. And they intended to create a mimetic type video or short interaction that would show their base in MAGA, look how tough they can be against Zelensky, and that he's not really our friend. In fact, he should be grateful for what we're doing. And unless he shows some of that gratefulness, we're going to treat him like any other kind of politician, and he needs to get in line with us. It's a very clear message there. And then that was completely an attempt to establish and form the dominance hierarchy, and they wanted Zelensky at the bottom of that in that room.
And was there something else going on, Erik, which is that Zelensky, of course, is an accomplished comedian. And it seemed to me that at several points during that very unpleasant interaction, he seemed to want to employ some kind of ironic energy. He wanted to change the tone of the interaction so that he was going to draw attention to exactly what was going on. And he attempted that on several occasions, but he had a problem, which is his audience, his immediate audience, Trump and Vance and the others who were there, are the most unironic people. I mean, there's no way, it seemed to me, that they were going to be able to pick that up. So you had a kind of a clash of modalities, so to speak. But I guess what is so important about what you're doing there, am I right in thinking that you could, in principle, break that down frame by frame and demonstrate precisely how that dynamic emerged and played out?
Yeah, you can, and that's what we do when we code this behavior. And it's fascinating when you watch the same event with sound on, and as rational beings trying to make sense of a complicated world, we pay a lot of attention to language, and we think that the primary meaning is conveyed in words, and to some extent, maybe even a large extent, it is, but it's not always the thing that carries the day. And so you can watch the same event with the sound off, and suddenly you're seeing something completely different.
Do you do that, methodologically, as a matter of interest? I mean, do you do that? Do you turn the sound?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a standard set of coding variables that may change from context to context, depending on what I'm looking at. But I always tell my coders, turn the sound off, to make sure that this behavior is actually occurring, not just that you think it is or it should be given what's being said, because sometimes you can have a really powerful move non-verbally when you're not saying much. So you think, well, that person's not anything to pay attention to, but they are visually. Or you can have a really weak kind of display, even though the person's trying to make a really strong point. And This comes up when there's gender dynamics at play in for instance, presidential debates. And so Hillary Clinton and you could say Kamala Harris both had really good points to make against Donald Trump. And Zelensky did too in the context, but, using irony. But that's lost when the visuals are so kind of hierarchical. When the visuals, there's such a contrast between one person kind of hogging the attention and drawing the attention and seeing more dominant and confident, and the other person maybe just being neutral but not showing that level of kind of matching their energy. The other thing I would say about language is when you get to things like irony and in-jokes and sarcasm and other nuances of language, particularly that kind of enter the realm of comedy. So you see this in the U.S. on late night shows, John Oliver, Jon Stewart, they're masters of it. These shows attract overwhelmingly liberal audiences. Is it only because the content is critical of conservatives? Not necessarily. A lot of this has to do with the openness to an ironic kind of argument or a sarcasm or very subtle forms of humor. And the conservative approach, I'm not quite sure about in the UK. I would imagine a little bit less so because I notice a lot of subtlety there. But in the US, subtlety and irony doesn't happen a whole lot in conservative circles.
Well, let me tell you, Britain has recently discovered unsubtlety. It's got a new channel called GB News, which is the British equivalent of Fox News, where everybody looks angry all the time. So there is no nuance. If they're not angry, then nothing's going on. Let me ask you about some specific forms of political display. And I was thinking about this earlier, and I thought there are three that listeners to this podcast might want to know about. I mean, the first is authority. I'm in charge. I know what I'm doing. You can rely on me. It doesn't have to be authoritarian, but it's authority. And the second one is one of us. I'm just like you. I understand you. We're going to get on well together because we're of the same type. And the third one that I suppose people associate with politicians is concealment, something along the lines of, I know what you want to know, but I'm not going to tell you it, whatever you do. Are there ways in which, for example, watching a televised election debate, but more generally watching political performances, are there specific variables associated with each of those displays?
Yeah, there actually would be. And authority is a little bit trickier than just a single display. You need to look at the response of the other person.
Uh-huh.
And let me start with my three basic, what we call emotion/motivational pairs. And that would be anger threat, which you're seeing on GB News now all the time. And welcome to our kind of hellish mediascape. Sorry.
Thanks for the gift.
There's also happiness reassurance. And the reason there's two words when we have these categories is one is the emotion that's kind of projected. Doesn't matter if it's authentic or not. Like you can convey anger. You don't necessarily have to feel it if you're good at kind of projecting it. And then the flip side or the motivation behind anger would be threat. And so with happiness, the motivation behind that is reassurance. Now there's a third one, which gets to your concealment kind of mode, which is fear and evasion. So you've got the emotion that might be expressed, and politicians are really good at hiding fear, although not always. And you probably saw a little bit of that along with surprise and shock by Zelensky in that White House meeting. But he probably quickly corrected for it. But evasion is very common. So when someone's not giving you the full truth or acting, in the Reagan kind of classic move that now even Vladimir Putin does. Oh yeah, I can't hear that question. The helicopters are too loud, or you're too far away. Evasion. That's a classic kind of sidestep, and is what politicians kind of live in that space of giving out just enough information to make the public or journalists feel informed, and hiding most of it so that they have maximum decisional latitude behind the scenes. They don't promise too much so they could go either direction or many different directions in finally making a policy decision. And you can code for these. And so what we do is we break down are individual kind of categories of emotion and motivation. And we track it by looking at what we call performative repertoire. So you think of a repertoire of somebody having a set of songs if they're a musician, or kind of a standard stump speech if they're a politician. Well, they're also doing things non-verbally and visually. And so we categorize these in different kind of ways. But one of the ways, given the rise of populist tactics and, this aggressive kind of in-your-face politics, we're starting to categorize different behaviors as populist tactics. We still have the kind of classic reassurance display, which is pretty rare for a populist. They're fighting for the people or fighting against the elites, and they're not really showing a lot of happiness reassurance all the time. Their audience is responding to that anger, which is why it works on TV. And there's also disruptive behaviors. So now, what are some individual categories that we code for? Well, in populist tactics, we're going to look for defiance gestures, kind of pumping of the fist, a pointing of the finger, a kind of a firm kind of forward, like stiff arm movement, something that is, which is another variable, what we call agentic. So it shows a lot of energy, a lot of kind of commitment to getting things done. And this is just, if you're standing there moving your arms in a certain way, people get a sense that, oh, you're angry, you're defiant, and you've got the energy to follow through with it. I kind of like that. It seems like someone who could get things done. That's kind of the interpretation. And we also look at the face, and we look at that in terms of anger, threat. We look at it in terms of happiness, reassurance. And there are particular signals. It's not just kind of a gestalt, interpretive exercise. It's actually pretty precise. And this was developed going back to the ethology studies in both animal and human behavior. What's happening with the eyebrows? What's happening with the eyelids? What's happening with the mouth? Or is there a certain show of teeth, for instance? And you think, teeth, what does that have to do with anything? When you smile and you think of, I'm just going to say Ronald Reagan in the classic Reagan smile that won people over, he's showing his upper teeth. There's no question. He's smiling big, and it's mostly upper teeth. When you're frowning, suddenly the upper teeth aren't in play, and you might see your lower teeth. And it's a really kind of aggressive, ornery, malevolent intent type of look. Now, that sounds like a woof. Well, it is. And it's very similar. Also with an anger display, your eyes are fixated. There's a stare on the target of your animosity. So your eyes aren't moving around. They're not looking down. They're fixed on the target. And with that comes a slight furrowed brow. So you can start to see there are indicators on a very subtle level that make this a very kind of systematic and therefore scientific coding kind of exercise and analysis. It's not just, oh, I think he means this, so I'm going to write an interpretive essay of what's going on with Donald Trump's gestures. Well, you can, obviously semiotics tells us that there is symbolic meaning in movement, but the way I do things, because I come more from a political science tradition, say, than a semiotics tradition, is that I want to be on firm ground so that when I go to use my variables and summarize them, and we try to predict things, for instance, like social media response or amount of television coverage or what's happening, more broadly against other candidates, that I feel like I'm on firm ground.
Absolutely fascinating. Erik, I'm very interested in how demagogues present themselves. And we've got lots to choose from these days. I guess, in a sense, they're more dependent upon pure symbolism because they've just got less other forms of accountability to offer. And I was interested in those recent images of Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un meeting together. I was wondering, is there such a thing, do you think, as an undemocratic or even an anti-democratic iconography of power? Is there something about them, if we didn't know the history and we didn't know that much about contemporary politics, in the way they carried themselves, they performed being politicians, that suggested that these guys are prepared to do anything except be democratic?
Yeah, no, I think there is, absolutely. And I've been really wanting to go back and do a historical nonverbal analysis of the 20th century's kind of leading demagogues and even, I don't know, late 19th century, since we have photographs. And I do think there's a certain kind of display, a certain mode of presentation that is recognizable when you see it. It tends to be somewhat stiff. It's very erect and upright. There's stare associated with it, not a lot of softness. There's a kind of projection of power. It's almost like a puffing up of the chest, but not quite literally, but a very kind of erect, tall, enlarged posture, and a looking around at the landscape, which I think is a part of it. It's not that they're looking at individuals and waving high like you're being nice, like a Bill Clinton or a Barack Obama. They don't care about that. They're surveying a vast, let's say, array of followers, and whether they're there or not, they act like they're there. And symbolically, that's hugely important. So we're doing some really interesting analysis right now as a colleague in Loughborough University, and she comes out of the perspective of dance. You think, what's dance got to do with politics? Well, it is a dance. And particularly when you look at movement in a public space, and it could be a debate stage, or it could be a public meeting, or a walk on a red carpet after you exit your plane. And the question is, how is the movement taking place? What are kind of the performative repertoires? And what are the eyes doing? And not just where are they looking, but although that's hugely important, but how are they looking? Is it a severe kind of judgmental type of look? And I think this gets to the demagogue. And what we noticed, we've coded now the 2016 presidential debate, which I had already coded, but we went back and now used measures of movement in a framework called kinesemiotics. So it's the meaning of movement. And what Donald Trump does, everybody focused on the way he followed Hillary Clinton around, which was very creepy and unusual and absolutely distracting, and performed the strategic goal of distracting the audience from anything she had to say. And I know this because I've shown it to focus groups, and I asked them immediately after showing the clip, so what was her policy position? What was she talking about? People can't even tell you the topic. The topic was healthcare, and she was talking about some problems and adjustments that needed to be done with Obamacare if she got elected. But Trump was hovering behind her, and that's all anybody could see. But when it came to Trump's turn to speak and have the floor, and she would look at the audience, and she would try to engage in an affiliative, friendly type of interaction and win that person over and show some empathy and kind of mutual understanding. The demagogue doesn't care about empathy. That's not their modality. They don't feel like they need to understand that person. They want that person to understand and appreciate and really respect and actually fear who they are and their power. And that's how they derive kind of their authority. And so what Trump does almost exclusively, he looks for the camera, and he's looking directly into the camera, and he's speaking to the wider audience that he wants to kind of develop as a follower base. And that's just the way demagogues think. They think in terms of these mass rallies, what we saw with Hitler and Mussolini. And people say, oh, well, it's a little extreme to go to Hitler. Well, is it non-verbally? I don't think so. And I think Trump may actually outperform some of the classic demagogues of the 20th century on a lot of different measures, but not all measures. And I'm just fascinated to find out what the result is.
That is such worthwhile research, and I very much look forward to reading it when it's published. Let me turn to a final question for you, and that is, I wonder whether you share my view that perhaps at times politicians should just relax. They should worry a bit less about their images. They should worry a bit less about what's going to go wrong. And in doing so, paradoxically, they'll have less to worry about, because a lot of what we are doing when we watch them is watching them strategically worrying. A, does that sound like anything like good advice? And B, is it advice that you think politicians could take?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of the most intuitive communicators without so many consultants around them actually do that, and to some effect. And the more they're allowed to do that by their handlers, I think the more authentic they come across. And we are in an age of kind of a yearning for authenticity. And that's kind of emerged as a new form of credibility. And so the more real you can be and relatable, the more the audience feels a connection. So let me give you a U.S. example and then a U.K. example. We had a member of Congress and a former mayor of El Paso named Beto O'Rourke run for Senate. He even ran for president. He ran for governor of Texas. And he didn't quite pull off the majority he needed. But boy, his communication style was universally lauded. And it was natural and spontaneous. And he got a hold of social media and Instagram and TikTok and the various short video format. And he would do things like not only like shake everybody's hand who stood in line to see him that day and travel to the same places over and over again. He would stay up till 11 at night, stop by a burger joint, order a cheeseburger, start to eat it while he's riding a skateboard around the parking lot. And it's just what he does. Like, he knows how to do it. This guy was in a punk rock band. When he was riding that board, you're like, yeah, I've seen that. You know, in fact, I grew up in Southern California. I know what skateboard riding looks like. It was absolute natural. And that got so many like young people interested and social media commentate, response, that it really gave him kind of a grassroots following. It's really authentic. And it didn't quite translate to a winning majority in Texas, but, there's a lot of restrictions on voting, like voter ID laws, that might have prevented some people from getting there. And of course, we don't have voting on by app yet, which I think would change the total context.
Yeah.
But in the UK, you've got a politician like Ed Davey, who kind of invented a new modality, a new type of political performance that you might call a planned accident, that absolutely seems endearing, but at the same time transforms the whole idea of a political event, of a media event. So he's out among the public just doing things that you wouldn't expect politicians to do, like paddleboarding and not being able to stand up, so he falls in the drink, and kind of, shows his good nature by laughing at it and actually kind of being relaxed. And he's giving out ice cream to kids and just being kind of a real person, the way we might know a friend. And the audience picks up on that. And the journalist might look at it cynically as just kind of a ploy or the latest gimmick. But there's actually, if the frame fits, wear it. And one comment before I make a kind of a summation about populace is that what we saw in our analysis in Image Bite Politics, our analysis of presidential campaigns, is that the Democrats tried to repeatedly use a soft populist kind of visual look and modality that just didn't fit who they were. So Al Gore would show up on the back of a pickup truck and shirt sleeves. It just didn't fit who he was. But if George W. Bush did it and he was on his ranch and he had his cowboy hat on, you knew that was the guy. And so I do agree with you that politicians need to relax. They need to be more of themselves and communicate more honestly, but good luck with that. But what populists have figured out is that there's a yearning, there's a desire for this. There's, in our mediatized culture, we've almost got overproduced, overscripted, over-advised. And that if you just let the person and their personality shine through, you can see that in someone like Zelensky. I think most people who would look at him and watch him and follow him and hear him on video have a good sense of who he is. The populists have figured this out. And so if that means breaking the rules, if that means acting like they would around their friends, or even in Trump's case, and he may be the only one that could get away with this, having so-called locker room talk, or a certain segment of the audience, particularly young males, this really has appealed. And so it's a new way of garnering attention, but also seeing more authentic at the same time, and allows them to focus on certain issues and talk a certain way that you probably couldn't get away with otherwise.
Erik, your insights have been really fascinating and eloquently stated. So thanks very much for your contribution to The Sound of Politics. And I hope that it also reminds our listeners that although there's a big emphasis here on what is being said and particularly how it is said, the voice is not a single organ and the body does a lot of things apart from make noises. Thanks, Erik.
Thank you for having me.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
Well, thanks for listening to The Sound of Politics. If you enjoyed this episode, then please tell others about it and make sure you're following the show to get updates when a new episode drops. We'd also like to hear from you. If you have any questions or thoughts of topics we should cover in future episodes, then get in touch. You'll find the contact details in the episode notes.